Hey folks, David Stewart here. Hope you guys are having a fantastic day. Let's talk about one of my favorite fantasy races, probably one of yours as well, which is the Orc. Orcs is precious. Orcs are present in a huge number of properties, from games to movies to books. Where do orcs come from? How does our current concept of what an orc looks like and acts like, where does that come from? And how can we use orcs as writers? These are the things that I want to talk about. So first of all, where do orcs come from? I want to talk about a couple of big things that I think are the sources for people's orcish concepts. The most important of them is J.R.R. Tolkien in Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and especially The Silmarillion, about what orcs are, the way they act, how they serve a purpose in the story. And then from that flow other things, right? Especially a couple of really big game franchises. The most important of them is actually Warhammer Fantasy and its derivative Warhammer 40K, but Warhammer Fantasy really, I guess, is the big one. There's a few other things that I think are derivative of that, which have orcs, and that's Elder Scrolls and especially Warcraft. And then the last one is Dungeons and Dragons, which has a little bit different concept of what orcs are, and they represent them a little bit different in their materials. So let's start with the biggie. Let's start with Tolkien. What are orcs in Tolkien's view? Well, we don't know exactly what they look like because he doesn't stop and go, they look like this. They're this tall with this, but we get various pieces of their physiology through what we hear about them in the books, that they're rather large, ape-like. They often stoop. Sometimes they go on all fours. They have a lot of coarse body hair. They have dark or black skin, not brown skin, but like black or gray skin. They have gross teeth, maybe bad breath. They speak in an uncouth manner. They're very savage to each other. They have no care for the other races of Middle-earth and very little care for each other. They will cannibalize each other if they need to. They wear rough armor and they have scimitars is what they tend to use. They live underground and dig tunnels. They make nothing beautiful, but they are intelligent and they are able to make industrial machines. In fact, Tolkien hints that they might be responsible for some of the ugly and destructive industrial machines that we use in the modern era. And that's important. That's an important detail because of what orcs represent in a broader sense in Tolkien's Middle-earth. So first of all, as a story element, what do orcs do? Well, they're a threat to the heroes. They're a monster. They're described in monstrous terms because they're monsters. Tolkien uses several different words, synonyms to describe orcs, including goblins, hobgoblins, and Uruk-hai. These are all varieties of the same basic thing. I think in The Hobbit, he uses goblins because there's already a concept pre-existing of what goblins might be. Some kind of monstrous little gross creature that lives in the dark. Orcs hate the sun. They hate the sun. That's really important. When we look at orcs as a bigger concept in Tolkien, I think you can see, again, his religious views permeate everything he does. As a Catholic, orcs are representative of his worldview and his view on humanity and sin and things like that. So orcs were made by Morgoth. They weren't made by Iluvatar. We don't know exactly how they were made, whether, Morgoth took elves and transformed them into orcs, or if he made some sort of race the way Aule did with dwarves, but they just came out as orcs, completely ruined and vicious and disgusting and serving Morgoth's purposes. But what they are, Morgoth can create nothing on its own. Evil can create nothing on its own. It can only mock and destroy. They are a mockery of the elves. The elves are the children of Iluvatar, as are men. And being the children of Iluvatar, they're made in his likeness and image. You have to remember, Tolkien is Catholic. Humans are made, we're made in the likeness and image of God. And so elves being in the likeness of an image of God, what does that mean? Well, that means in a physical sense, they're like God. They're beautiful. They're attractive to look at. They have aesthetic value all on their own. Their minds are like Iluvatar and they are in harmony with him. And elves themselves, we'll do another video on elves that kind of derive from older concepts of like nature spirits. So when elves invent things, and they invent many different things like that appear magical, they appear magical because they're in harmony with the world. Whereas when orcs create inventions, they destroy the creation. So Orcs' inventions do things like tear down trees, burn the trees, to fire a furnace, to turn a wheel, to make something, to dig a hole, just dig through it. You're not making beautiful corridors. You're not making buildings like mansions of the dwarves. You're just digging tunnels to throw your garbage in, basically. So everything an orc does is destructive and is in disharmony with all of creation, because Morgoth was the source of all dissonance in the music before time. Morgoth is against God, and so his orcs are not just a perversion, they're a mockery of elves, they're a mockery of men, they are the opposite of them. They're ugly because elves and men are made in the likeness and image of God. They're evil because elves and men are made to be good, because, you know, they're made in the likeness and image of God. A lot of this has to do with the concept of original sin, which I don't have the time to get into really deep here, but if you're not Catholic, original sin is something you inherit. It's not something that you do. The Protestant view of sin tends to be sin is something you do. Ancestral sin, which is how the Orthodox express it, and original sin, it's a tendency. It's not just a tendency, but it's something you inherit that is taken away with baptism, and it's part of the corruption of your nature. So the orcs represent like a fully corrupt nature, a nature maybe even without any spiritual knowledge. Elves have spiritual knowledge because they're part of being Iluvatar's children. They have a mind like God. And so orcs maybe not. They may have no spiritual knowledge, which would explain their attitude towards nature and each other, their willingness to just eat human beings or eat each other, and do all of the evil things that they do. They're a fully evil race because they represent that full encapsulation of sin to me. So this is me analyzing Tolkien, but I think a lot of this has important effects on how we see orcs kind of permeated in other works. Orcs are something that is evil. So when we go to Dungeons and Dragons, orcs are an evil race. They look a little bit differently than how orcs are presented maybe in some other works. Orcs are pig-like. They have like pig faces. So think of Ganon from the 80s. You're really looking at what orcs looked like in most D&D art in the 1980s. They were like pig-like. They were gross-looking. They had like maybe tusks. And they were evil. They were demi-humans that really just would kill you. So you never really talk to an orc or negotiate with an orc. I mean, you can, depending on, you know, how whatever you're doing in D&D. But for the most part, they exist to fight the enemies. And you can't play as an orc, in most of the older editions at least. You couldn't play as an orc, but you could be a half-orc. So a half-orc could have at least some spiritual knowledge, let's say. It could be, you could have a good character, be a half-orc. And you'd have maybe some of the characteristics of orcs, like strength and stuff like that. But orcs were also pretty stupid. They weren't very smart. So a lot of the demi-humans in early D&D were rather stupid, like kobolds. They didn't really have any kind of advanced ability to utilize technology or anything like that. They were just kind of stupid. And I think that was pretty influential on some of our ideas of orcs. Orcs as being these stupid or like kind of savage creatures. Whereas in Tolkien, they are savage, but not in that way. They're not primitive. Rather, they're industrial savagery. It's the savagery of the industrial society that orcs represent, not the savagery of primitivism. By the time we get to Warhammer Fantasy, though, orcs have really taken on a bunch of little features that get used over and over again after Warhammer Fantasy. So the first one is green skin. So the green skin orc is really from Warhammer Fantasy, and the only other orc I could think of with green skin is maybe from Return of the Jedi, and he's not necessarily an orc, but he's a pig man creature with green skin, and that's an orc-looking creature. So they have green skin, they have like the big tusks, the flat faces, they're bigger than people, they're muscular, but they have kind of disproportionately large arms and things like that. The orcs from Warhammer Fantasy, and then ORK orcs from Warhammer 40k, mostly have the same kind of features to them. That's where we get this idea of like this green-skinned goblin-like thing that is really stupid. So in Warhammer Fantasy, they're not smart at all. They just kind of rove around in hordes. I think it hasn't been fully explained. They don't reproduce like normal creatures. Rather, they reproduce like via spores. They're like semi-fungal creatures. Like they just emit spores, and then the little squibs grow in the mud and come out. And so we see that in the in the Fellowship of the Ring movie, we see orcs being born via squib mode from Warhammer Fantasy. So going all the way down to where we were returning to Tolkien in when did the first one come out? The year 2001. We see an orc being pulled out of the mud and having a membrane pulled off of him like he's a squib, like the little orc youngs are crawling out of the mud in the orc lands. That's how we get orcs born in the movies. It's actually, I think, derivative of Warhammer Fantasy. So most of those things come from Warhammer Fantasy. And then, of course, when you have Warcraft, it's just taking the stuff from Warhammer Fantasy and just ripping it off. And you can correct me if I'm wrong here and tell me if I'm wrong or to what degree I'm wrong or right. But I think the original Warcraft game by Blizzard Entertainment was intended to be a Warhammer game, but they couldn't work out the licensing, so they ended up making their own IP. They just called it Warcraft, but it really uses the same orcs. They're green-skinned, big teeth, savage and warlike, and the only difference between them and the greenskins of Warhammer is this: they take on the qualities of Mongolians or various Asian steppe people that are humans. So their culture is, their aesthetics, I should say, replicate like Mongolian, the idea of Mongolian tent people or the Turkic peoples from the steppes of Asia. And their society is a horde. They call it the horde, like the Golden Horde, and so they are just a horde of crazy good warriors that fly through and don't live in any permanent settlements. They're a nomadic people. That slowly transforms into the modern Warcraft version of the orc. I guess around Warcraft 3 it changes into this, which is the orc as the noble savage. The orc as a primitive savage but ultimately good creature that's been corrupted by like demonic blood. And that's the only reason they were evil in the first two games, is the curse of Manaroth, right? They drank the blood of Manaroth. They originally had brown skin, more like, previous older orcs, So they originally had brown skin. They transformed into evil green skins. And that's why they were fundamentally evil in the first two games. But they became noble savages around Warcraft 3. And that leaves you at an interesting kind of predicament with the modern horde in World of Warcraft, which is that they have goblins. Now, goblins represent that industrial evil that is present in the original Tolkien view of orcs as being industrious, not caring for nature, destroying the environment with their industrial tools and things like that. So the goblins are the antithesis of the noble savage. They are an industrial savage. So it seems like they wouldn't really get along with the orcs and the trolls, who are these noble savage kind of creatures. But whatever. They exist. That's their flavor in the game. They make big pools of muck, oil fins, and they build shredders that just chop down trees. They're completely destructive. They destroy forests in order to build speedways for their cars, which blow up from time to time because they really don't care to make things good or beautiful. They just make industrial things that are ugly and horrible looking. So it's kind of a weird matchup there. So that, I think the noble savage part, that if you look at something like Thrall, if you look at Thrall as a character, he's a shaman and he's in tune with the natural spirits, and he's fundamentally a good character, not an evil character. So around Warcraft 3, we start to shift into this noble savage view, that they're primitive, but they're not evil. And I think that's been really influential on the way a lot of people view orcs, as like these sort of primitive, primal, in touch with nature, noble savage kind of creatures. Noble savage is a myth that really rises in the 19th century from urban people looking at quote, more primitive people like American Indians and thinking they're closer to God or they're morally better because they're closer to nature, when living in the wilds brings its own struggles and its own difficulties, and you certainly don't escape interpersonal conflict simply by being living a tribal lifestyle out in the wilderness rather than living in a city. But for city dwellers, that's something that they looked at, was like, oh, the natural guy is better. So orcs become this, rather than an industrious kind of tunnel-dwelling creature, they become a noble savage. And then I guess the last game franchise I can mention there is the Elder Scrolls. The Elder Scrolls is mostly derivative of Warhammer Fantasy as far as it has orcs. Orcs are green-skinned in most of the games, but they become gray or black-skinned in Elder Scrolls V, and I think they're gray-skinned in Elder Scrolls Online. You might be able to make green skins, but their skin texture changes fundamentally by the time you get to Elder Scrolls V to make them a little more down to earth, a little less Warhammery, a little less Shrek. That's kind of the joke, is they all look like Shrek in Oblivion. And they take on more of that noble savage kind of thing. They're just another, they're a little bit more savage kind of people always in Elder Scrolls. But then they have their own holds and stuff in Skyrim, and their own little culture that's kind of insular and directed towards themselves. And they are supposedly the product of a Daedra. Again, this is like Tolkien. The Daedra made them, and they're ugly. And so I think it's Moloch Ball. And so they are being his favorites because they're ugly. They are like the children of Moloch Ball. They're kind of a perversion of the rest of the good-looking races in Tamriel. The elves, the Man and Mer races, if you will. And I'm not sure which one they belong to. Maybe Mer. I think they're considered like some version of elves, so they're just really ugly. So that's the last game franchise that I think has had a lot of influence. Now, I've used orcs in my work, and I chose the word orc because I think it would conjure up the right image in people's mind. This image that I've been talking about of an overlarge, kind of monstrous humanoid character, maybe bigger and stronger than a man, more savage, more direct, more uncouth, maybe a little bit ugly. So they're present in Water of Awakening, and they're even more present in Needle Ash. But my orcs are more like Germans to me than like the Asian steppe people that you get with the Warcraft orcs. And I mean Germans in antiquity. Germans as the Romans knew them, not Germans as we know them today, not like, Germans, but these barbarian savages from the north that don't have any cities. There's no Germanic cities during antiquity. The Romans live in cities, the Germans don't. The barbarians live a tribal lifestyle. They have no civilization. They have no written language. And that's what the orcs are in most of my fantasy books. Now, I'll give you a clue as to what they really are. They're actually a derivative of an older race. They're the same race as the Dryson. So if you've read Crown of Sight, which you can read, the Dryson are the main antagonists in this book. And the orcs are really the same race as them, but they are just a race of them that doesn't have cities and doesn't have the organized culture, has maybe a variant of that culture that is directed towards more ancestral living. They live in what's called the Orcish drylands, so they live out in the steppes, and they don't interact a lot with the other people, except they are often mercenaries, which was true of the Germans during antiquity. They'd end up in Roman legions. The various German tribes would come down and settle and end up being part of Rome. So they're often mercenaries, and otherwise they kind of keep to their own little area. They sometimes fight with each other, so they're not really unified, but they're not savage or evil to each other. Rather, they represent a different lineage of the people of my fantasy world. People that don't really have any access to magic. They don't have the spiritual knowledge in the same degree that humans and elves do. So they are just a different kind of people, a more base people. Not evil, not good either, but a little bit more primitive, a little bit more savage, if you will, but not savage like without morals, savage in that they're closer to like a tribal lifestyle. And that's how I've used them. And they're in contrast to the Dryson, who we'll meet in some other books that I'll come out with later. And that you can see in Crown of Sight, which are a much bigger and more evolved race, let's say. And they look on their Western cousins, the orcs, as it's kind of a fallen race, like a bunch of weird savages living out in the sticks. That's how they tend to view them. But anyway, leave me your thoughts down below about orcs, like what your favorite version of orcs are. What do you think they really should represent? Should they be monstrous? How you'd use them in stories? The main use of them in Tolkien's story was to attack the heroes, right? They're the bad guys. Do you think it's okay for them to be evil races? What do you think orcs should be? Let me know, and I'll talk to you next time. Have a great day.